Welcome to Brothers of the Word, because, brother, you need the Word. And I want to ask you a question. Do you really love you? And I'm going to give you a test today and just some questions and some general guidelines where you can answer that question. Do you really love you? And some of you may say, well, of course I love me. And even if you do love you, without question, everyone who is either watching or listening to the sound of my voice right now, you know someone who does not love themselves. You know someone who feels down and who feels negative and who has a bad self-image and who feels that they are not worth much. Even if you feel good about you, you know someone who does not. So I encourage you to listen to this message and to share it with others, because it will help someone feel better about themselves. This is a continuation of the sermon, The Power of Love. It's sermon number 5508. And in that sermon, I said at the end of it, I would give some cues and some tips on how you could love you. And this will be a series of sermons basically on how to love you. We know the verse where Jesus says, you shall love thy neighbor as thyself. And the whole premise is, how can you love your neighbor worth a hoot if you don't love yourself worth a hoot? If you hate you, and the Bible says, love thy neighbor as thyself, and you hate you, it automatically means you're going to hate your neighbor. A lot of hate in the world comes because people really don't love themselves. And even though that verse is in the New Testament, it did not originate in the New Testament. That's an Old Testament thing. In Leviticus 19:18, God himself says, thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of my people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. You all thought Jesus was the first one who said that. No. Even Jesus said, look, I can't do anything that I don't see my daddy do. His daddy said that back in Leviticus. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Jesus took it and expounded upon it in Matthew 22, beginning at verse 37, when he said, Jesus said unto him, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all of the law and the prophets. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with everything that you have, and love your neighbor like you love yourself. Now, I am going to be dealing with a series of actually a grand total of 8 sermons, counting the power of love as the first one, just dealing with this whole thing of how to love you, because it's deep and it's complicated and it is not easy to transform. Today's message is entitled, How to Know When You Don't Love You. See, everyone may think that they do love themselves, but really, how do you really know when you don't love you? I'm going to give you some tests today where you can tell if you really love you or not. The next sermon will be the difference between healthy self-esteem and boastful pride. You know, you can love yourself too much. So you have to have a balance of all of this stuff. So you just can't focus everything on just loving you. That can get way overboard. You've got to have a balance of knowing how to love yourself properly so that it does not move into heavy-duty pride. Next sermon will be what to do when others don't love you. Some of you are in some situations right now and folk really don't love you, like you're in jobs and folk don't love you. You're in relationships and folk don't. What do you do when folk don't love you. And then there's the first step to loving you, the second step to loving you, and the third step to loving you. 3 very important keys, and each takes a full message to define and explain so you'll understand. And finally, how to give yourself a hug. And you'll be able to hear all of these sermons. Just go to brothersoftheword.com and you can click series and watch or listen to the entire series absolutely free. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Carl Sandburg said, love your neighbor as yourself, but don't take down the fence. And there's a good principle behind that, because you've got to love people like you do you, but sometimes you do have to keep some fences up. That old saying that good fences make good neighbors. But you just can't love your neighbor if you don't like you. And I'm going to even take it a step further. Not only can you not love your neighbor if you don't like you, you can't even love God if you don't like you. What do you mean you can't? You can't even love God if you don't like you. Because see, if you don't like you, you don't like what God made. You don't like his creation. You don't like his product. See, and since you are made, and since I am made in the image of God, if I don't like me, I don't like God. And if you don't love you, you in truth really cannot love God. Now, this is a brother point. You have to love yourself to truly love God, because you are in the image of God. You have to love yourself to truly love God, because you are in the image of God. Let me give you an example. If a person really loves a product, some of you got some fashions that you really love. Some of you all may love some Christian Dior and all that kind of stuff. Well, if you really kind of love the company, you love the products of the company in truth. Some of you are electronic gadgets, and some of you are really just Apple fans. You just like Apple products. You just love that company. Well, you love that company because you love the creations of the company. Some of you love some of your favorite musical stars. And it's not so much the musical stars who you love. You love the music that they make. So the same principle or corollary applies to you as the creation of God. When you don't love his creation, there's something that's innate, that when you don't love the product, you can't love the company that made the product. So when you don't love you, you really can't even love God or your neighbor, because you are in the image of God. Now, the number one, what I would call manifestation of people really not liking themselves, the number one manifestation is one of the top killers of teenagers. The number one killer is car accidents. Right behind car accidents is suicide. It's the ultimate expression of someone saying, I really don't like me. I don't like me. I don't like my life. I don't like what I'm going through. I really don't like my circumstances, and I'm just taking myself out of here. Suicide is the ultimate expression of a person who really does not like themselves. And even though it's a very high statistic among teenagers, suicide is the number 10 leading cause of death in the United States. And it's a number 10 leading cause of death. But for every person who successfully, if you can call it success, for every person who successfully commits suicide, there are 11 attempts. And this lets you know just how many people really hate themselves and their lives just by the number of people who commit suicide. And almost every adult in this congregation has been touched in one form or another by suicide. Everyone knows someone who's relatively close to you who has killed themselves. I remember growing up, our next door neighbor blew his brains out. And he was a college professor. So it wasn't like he was a stupid man. He had all this education, but he blew himself out because he got to the point where he simply says, I don't like me and my life, and I'm going to end it all. How do you know when you don't like you? Suicide is particularly prevalent among men. Men are 5 or 6 times more likely to kill themselves than women. But it is not that men don't like themselves more than women. Men are just more physical in their expression of an issue. Women are going to cry. They'll boo-hoo to death because the rate of depression among women is double the rate of depression among men. And depression is the #1 factor and determinant of suicide. So women got more depression than men. They just don't kill themselves like men do. There are 2 groups who don't kill themselves, who have the lowest rate of suicide. #1 is women. #2 are black people. Now, black people got all kind of issues and all kind of problems, and they rate worse in almost every other stat but suicide. Somehow, black folk have the ability that they hunker down and make it through this thing no matter what. You know, so it's a... But also, African Americans are the most religious group in America. And that correlation may have a strong determinant as to why black folk don't kill themselves very much. We got the lowest rate of all of the ethnic groups in the country. Black folk kill themselves the least. Because when you hang on to God, you can go through just a whole lot of stuff. Even when there is a whole lot of stuff. And it's not new. You know, in 2 Samuel verse 17:23, it says, and when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his ass and arose and gat him home to his house, to his city, and put his household in order and hanged himself and died and was buried in the sepulchre of his father. They didn't take his advice. So he just went and just hung himself. And that was back in the Old Testament. See, nothing is really new. People, do you know sometimes people will reject what you have to offer? And folk get depressed, get all bent out of shape, and they think that it reflects upon them. And as a result, they end up not liking themselves and doing something real crazy. I get a lot of prayer requests through Mountain Wings. And another phenomena among young folk is this phenomena called cutting. When they are depressed, they will take a sharp instrument and just cut themselves. There are some things that, to be honest about, I just cannot relate to. I absolutely avoid all kind of cutting or hurt on my body. But you see, when you don't feel good about yourself, you will do things to harm yourself because for some reason you feel like you deserve the hurt and the pain and the harm. And suicide and cutting, those are, and most of the cutting is done by women. Most of the suicide is done by men, but the cutting is done by women. When you don't feel good about you, you will treat you some of any kind of way. And when you treat you some of any kind of way and don't feel good about you, you cannot treat other people good. You can't love other people. So there's a real important point that we have to understand. We have to learn how to love us. Do you really love you? Self-hatred or self-loathing, it's prevalent in this world. The psychological term for it is called autophobia. Some of us just have autophobia. It's self-fear, self-hate.
Hallelujah. Brothers of the word, when the voice of God is heard, brothers of the word, there's a word from God for everyone. Brothers of the word, because brother, you need the word. Brothers of the word. Brothers of the word. Where the voice of God is heard. Brothers of the word.